The death of Ramesses II in 1213 BCE leaves behind an Egyptian empire fundamentally transformed from anything our history records. This is no longer merely a regional power dominating the Nile Valley and projecting force into neighboring territories. It is the world's first industrial superpower, a technological hegemon whose influence extends across the Mediterranean world and beyond, reshaping civilizations in its wake. The immediate succession proves smoother than many expected. Ramesses' son Merneptah inherits not just the throne but a sophisticated industrial and administrative apparatus. Unlike the pharaohs of our timeline, who relied primarily on personal charisma and religious authority, the rulers of industrial Egypt command institutional power through the engineer-priest class, standardized education, and bureaucratic systems designed specifically to maintain technological supremacy. Merneptah faces his first significant challenge in 1208 BCE when a coalition of Libyan tribes launches a major invasion of Egypt's western territories. In our timeline, this invasion posed a serious threat to Egyptian security. In this alternate world, it encounters an overwhelming industrial response. Steam-powered warships rapidly deploy troops along the coast. Standardized iron weapons equip Egyptian forces. Most dramatically, the first primitive land-based steam engines, essentially armored platforms mounting spear throwers and early projectile weapons, terrify the Libyan cavalry and break their formations. The invasion is crushed decisively. This victory solidifies a pattern that will define Egypt's relationship with barbarian peoples for centuries to come. Superior technology creates such overwhelming military advantage that direct conquest often proves unnecessary. Instead, defeated peoples are incorporated into Egypt's expanding industrial system, sometimes as workers in mining operations or factories, sometimes as auxiliary troops equipped with Egyptian weapons, and occasionally as semi-autonomous client states whose rulers gain privileged access to Egyptian technology in exchange for loyalty. By 1200 BCE, as the Bronze Age collapse accelerates across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, Egypt stands as an island of stability and technological advancement in a sea of chaos. The Mycenaean palace culture in Greece disintegrates. The Hittite Empire fractures. City-states across the Levant face waves of displacement and invasion. Trade networks that sustained complex societies for centuries unravel. In our timeline, even Egypt struggled during this period, barely maintaining its territorial integrity while losing much of its international influence. But industrial Egypt navigates these troubled waters with remarkable success, turning crisis into opportunity. As neighboring civilizations collapse, Egypt's technological vassals become full colonies. Refugees with valuable skills are settled in industrial centers. Vital resources in destabilized regions are secured through direct intervention. The city of Ugarit provides a telling example of this process. In our timeline, this significant trading center on the Syrian coast was completely destroyed around 1190 BCE, its destruction symbolizing the severity of the Bronze Age collapse. In this alternate history, as Ugarit faces threats from sea raiders and inland tribal movements, Egypt dispatches a fleet of steam-powered warships carrying prefabricated defensive structures and standardized weapons. Egyptian engineers establish a defensive perimeter, complete with early steam-powered watchtowers and alarm systems. Ugarit survives not as an independent city-state but as an Egyptian industrial outpost, its economy reorganized around Egyptian technological priorities. Similar interventions across the eastern Mediterranean create a patchwork of Egyptian industrial colonies, client states, and protectorates. Cyprus becomes essentially an Egyptian island, its copper resources fully integrated into Egyptian industrial production. Crete, while maintaining cultural autonomy, hosts major Egyptian shipyards and naval bases. Even mainland Greece, descending into what would historically be its dark ages after Mycenaean collapse, sees Egyptian outposts established at strategic locations like Corinth and Pylos, where industrial technologies are introduced to selected local elites. Perhaps the most significant development of this period is Egypt's technological response to the Sea Peoples, those mysterious maritime raiders who contributed significantly to the Bronze Age collapse. Rather than merely defeating them in battle, industrial Egypt embarks on a policy of selective integration. Certain Sea Peoples groups are settled in controlled territories and introduced to Egyptian industrial techniques, creating hybrid communities that combine Egyptian technology with distinctive cultural elements. The Shurden, one Sea People group, become specialists in metallurgy after being settled near Egyptian mining operations in Sinai. The Peleset, historical Philistines, develop expertise in mechanical engineering rather than establishing independent city-states in Canaan as they did in our timeline. Over generations, these communities evolve into specialized industrial castes, their distinctive cultural identities persisting even as they become fully integrated into Egypt's technological apparatus. By 1150 BCE, with the worst of the Bronze Age collapse behind it, industrial Egypt begins a new phase of expansion and consolidation. The Egyptian New Kingdom has not fallen as it did historically, instead, it has transformed into what historians of our alternate timeline might call the Egyptian Industrial Empire. Its borders now extend far beyond traditional Egyptian territories to encompass a complex network of directly administered provinces, industrial colonies, and client states stretching from Nubia in the south to Anatolia in the north, from Libya in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. This is not an empire of uniform control but of technological hierarchy. At its center stands Egypt proper, the Nile Valley and Delta, where the most advanced technologies are developed and the engineer-priest class maintains its headquarters. The next tier consists of fully industrialized colonies where Egyptian personnel operate factories, power plants, and transportation networks. Beyond these lie client states where local rulers maintain political authority but depend on Egyptian technology. At the periphery are trading partners and occasional targets of resource extraction expeditions, places that encounter Egyptian industrial products but have little direct access to their production. The technological innovations of this period are remarkable, each building upon the industrial foundation established in earlier centuries. Around 1120 BCE, Egyptian engineers developed the first practical water wheel-powered trip hammers, mechanizing the forging process for iron tools and weapons. By 1100 BCE, primitive mechanical calculators appear, devices using gears and dials to perform standardized calculations for engineering and astronomical purposes. Most significantly, around 1080 BCE, Egyptian technical writings begin to show evidence of early scientific method, systematic observation, hypothesis testing, and mathematical analysis applied to technological problems. This represents a crucial acceleration in the pace of innovation, as Egyptian engineer priests move beyond trial and error and traditional knowledge to something resembling modern research and development. The social consequences of sustained industrialization become increasingly profound. Urban population soars as rural workers migrate to industrial centers. A recognizable middle class emerges, composed of skilled technicians, industrial administrators, and specialized traders. Literacy spreads beyond the traditional scribal class to include practical technical education for industrial workers. Women gain unprecedented economic roles in certain industries, particularly textiles, ceramics, and precision assembly work, where steam-powered machinery reduces the importance of physical strength. Egyptian culture itself evolves in response to these changes. Art increasingly depicts industrial themes alongside traditional religious and royal subjects. Literature expands to include technical manuals, worker regulations, and even the first speculative writings about future technologies. Religious practice incorporates industrial rituals, the blessing of steam engines, the consecration of factories, prayers for successful mechanical operations. Perhaps most remarkably, around 1050 BC, the first proto-newspapers appear, papyrus bulletins produced using standardized printing techniques, stamps and stencils rather than movable type, to disseminate technical information, industrial regulations, and marketplace news. Initially restricted to the industrial administrative class, these publications gradually reach a wider audience, creating the ancient world's first mass media. Environmental impacts intensify during this period of expansion. Deforestation accelerates across the Mediterranean basin as trees are harvested for charcoal production. Mining operations scar landscapes from Iberia to the Caucasus. Air pollution becomes severe enough in major industrial centers to be mentioned in Egyptian medical texts, which prescribe remedies for the coughing sickness of the factory districts. Yet this industrial civilization also shows surprising sophistication in addressing environmental challenges. Around 1030 BCE, Egyptian engineers developed the first large-scale solar concentrators, massive arrays of polished metal mirrors focusing sunlight to generate steam without combustion. By 1000 BCE, systematic reforestation projects are underway in heavily harvested areas, motivated primarily by the pragmatic need to ensure future resource availability rather than by ecological consciousness as we would understand it. Water management becomes increasingly sophisticated, building on Egypt's millennia of hydraulic engineering experience. Dams, canals, and reservoirs regulate water flow for both agricultural and industrial purposes. Primitive filtration systems attempt to mitigate industrial pollution in the Nile and other waterways. While far from our modern environmental standards, these efforts represent a level of resource management unprecedented in the ancient world. As the first millennium BCE dawns, industrial Egypt begins to encounter new challenges and opportunities from emerging civilizations on its periphery. The Phoenicians, historically the Mediterranean's greatest seafarers, develop an erratically different direction in this timeline. Rather than establishing independent city-states and colonial networks, they become specialized maritime contractors within Egypt's industrial sphere, operating trading vessels, establishing remote outposts, and connecting Egypt's far-flung industrial colonies. The early Israelites, whose historical development was deeply influenced by Egyptian cultural and religious concepts, take a different path in this alternate timeline. Rather than establishing an independent kingdom defined partly in opposition to Egyptian power, they become a distinctive industrial community specialized in textile production and precision metalwork. Their monotheistic religious concepts evolve to incorporate technological elements. Their single god becomes associated with both creative and technical knowledge, their prophets sometimes delivering divine instructions for mechanical innovations. Perhaps the most significant cultural exchange occurs between industrial Egypt and the emerging Greek civilization. As Greece emerges from its post-Mycenaean Dark Age around 900 BCE, it does so under heavy Egyptian technological influence. Early Greek city-states import Egyptian industrial techniques, sometimes adopting them directly, sometimes modifying them to suit local conditions and cultural preferences. Greek mythology reflects this technological diffusion. Hephaestus, the smith god, gains heightened importance, his forge now explicitly modeled on Egyptian industrial techniques. Prometheus' gift of fire to humanity expands to include technical knowledge symbolized by Egyptian-style mechanical devices. The labyrinth of Daedalus becomes a metaphor for complex mechanical systems rather than merely a maze. Yet the Greeks also begin to develop distinctive approaches to technology that will eventually challenge Egyptian industrial orthodoxy. Around 800 BCE, Greek natural philosophers begin questioning the religious framework that Egyptian engineer priests have built around industrial knowledge. They seek naturalistic explanations for steam power, metallurgy, and mechanical principles, gradually developing theoretical frameworks that separate technological understanding from religious authority. By 750 BCE, this intellectual ferment produces the first significant technological innovations to emerge from outside Egypt's direct influence. Greek engineers developed distinctive shipbuilding techniques that, while still utilizing Egyptian-style steam power, create vessels better suited to the varied conditions of the Aegean. Greek metallurgists perfect new alloys that improve upon Egyptian standards. Most significantly, Greek mechanical engineers begin experimenting with miniaturization, creating smaller, more efficient versions of Egyptian industrial devices. The relationship between Egypt and Greece during this period is complex, part mentor and student, part competing technological traditions. Egypt maintains overall industrial superiority through its established infrastructure, vast resources, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. But Greek innovation increasingly represents a creative challenge to Egyptian technological orthodoxy. In the Western Mediterranean, the interaction of Egyptian industrial influence with local cultures produces equally fascinating developments. The early Etruscan civilization in Italy absorbs Egyptian industrial techniques filtered through Greek and Phoenician intermediaries, adapting them to local resources and needs. By 700 BCE, the Etruscan cities have developed their own distinctive industrial tradition, particularly excelling in hydraulic engineering and architectural applications of steam power. Meanwhile, the settlement that will become Rome begins its development under very different circumstances than in our timeline. Founded around 753 BCE according to tradition, early Rome in this alternate world immediately encounters Egyptian and Greek industrial technologies. Rather than developing as a primarily agricultural and military society that gradually absorbs Greek cultural influences, Rome emerges from the beginning as a hybrid civilization combining Latin social structures with imported industrial techniques. North Africa experiences perhaps the most dramatic transformation from our historical timeline. Rather than seeing the rise of independent Carthage as a Phoenician colony, the region becomes an extension of Egypt's industrial heartland. Cities along the North African coast develop as specialized manufacturing centers, exploiting local resources and climate conditions for industrial purposes. What would have been Carthage instead becomes an Egyptian industrial colony specializing in shipbuilding and maritime technology. Meanwhile, in the Near East, the Assyrian Empire rises around 900 BCE, facing a very different geopolitical landscape than in our timeline. Rather than expanding into the power vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse, it encounters the firmly established industrial hegemony of Egypt. Assyrian military expansion is contained, but the Assyrians prove adept at absorbing and adapting Egyptian industrial techniques. By 800 BCE, Assyria has developed into Egypt's primary industrial rival, specializing in military applications of steam technology and mechanical systems. Assyrian innovation focuses particularly on siege engines and logistics, steam-powered battering rams, mobile drilling platforms for undermining walls, and mechanical missile launchers that improve upon Egyptian designs. This technological competition drives innovation on both sides, accelerating the ancient world's industrial development. The 8th and 7th centuries BCE see an unprecedented flourishing of industrial civilization across the Mediterranean world and Near East. Cities grow to sizes that would not be matched until the Roman Empire in our timeline. Trade networks extend from the British Isles to India, carrying not just goods but technical knowledge. Literacy rates far exceed what our ancient world achieved, driven by the practical needs of industrial administration and technical education. Around 700 BCE, the most significant technological breakthrough since the original development of steam power emerges from Egyptian research centers: primitive electricity generation. Building on observations of static electricity and experiments with certain fish that produce electric shocks, Egyptian engineer priests developed the first crude batteries and electrical demonstration devices. While practical applications remain limited primarily to electroplating metals and creating spectacular religious displays, the theoretical foundation is laid for future electrical technologies. By 650 BCE, the Mediterranean world has developed into a complex industrial ecosystem centered on Egypt but now featuring multiple competing technological traditions: Egyptian, Greek, Assyrian, Etruscan, and others. The pace of innovation accelerates as these traditions interact, compete, and cross-pollinate. Technical knowledge spreads through an increasingly sophisticated network of schools, libraries, and what we might recognize as early technical publications. The environmental consequences of 3 centuries of industrial development become increasingly severe. Deforestation has transformed landscapes across the Mediterranean basin. Mining has exhausted easily accessible deposits of copper, tin, and other metals, driving exploration and colonization into ever more remote regions. Air and water pollution affects major urban centers, with soot, chemical contamination, and waste disposal creating public health challenges discussed in the medical texts of the period. Yet this early industrial world also shows remarkable adaptability in the face of these challenges. Solar power increasingly supplements combustion in regions with abundant sunlight. Wind power sees systematic development, with standardized windmills appearing across the Mediterranean by 600 BCE. Water power reaches new levels of sophistication, with complex systems of dams, sluices, and water wheels maximizing energy extraction from rivers and streams. Even early forms of recycling appear, initially driven by practical economics rather than environmental consciousness. Metal scrapping and reprocessing becomes a significant industry in major urban centers. Glass and ceramics are routinely crushed and reused in new products. Organic waste is systematically collected for agricultural fertilizer in the intensive farming operations that feed the growing urban populations. As the 6th century BCE begins, this industrialized ancient world stands at the threshold of what we might recognize as early modernity. The social, economic, and technological foundations have been laid for developments that would not emerge until the 18th and 19th centuries in our timeline: mass production, mechanized transportation, early telecommunications, and even the first tentative steps toward computing and electrical power. The geopolitical landscape continues to evolve, with Egypt maintaining overall technological leadership but facing increasingly sophisticated challenges from Greek, Assyrian, and other industrial traditions. The rise of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II demonstrates how thoroughly industrial technology has transformed warfare and statecraft, as Babylonian engineers adapt and improve upon both Egyptian and Assyrian innovations to create new military and architectural applications. Perhaps most significantly, The intellectual paradigms governing this industrial world begin to shift in ways that will have profound implications for future development. The rigid theological framework that initially contained Egyptian industrial knowledge gradually gives way to more naturalistic, philosophical approaches pioneered by Greek thinkers but increasingly adopted across the Mediterranean world. Around 580 BCE, the first comprehensive theoretical works on mechanics, thermodynamics, and material science appear, texts that separate technological principles from religious dogma and establish the foundations for systematic scientific inquiry. While still primitive by our modern standards, these works represent a crucial transition from technology as divinely revealed knowledge to technology as the product of human understanding of natural principles. By 550 BCE, 400 years after Senenmut's first crude steam pump, the ancient world has been transformed beyond recognition from what our history records. Steam power drives factories, ships, and early land vehicles. Iron and steel production reaches levels that our world would not achieve until the late Middle Ages. Glass, ceramics, textiles, and other materials are mass-produced to standardized designs. Urban populations live in cities with running water, primitive sewage systems, and public transportation. A visitor from our timeline would find this alternate ancient world both familiar and utterly alien. The architectural aesthetics remain recognizably Egyptian, Greek, or Mesopotamian, but these traditional forms now incorporate industrial elements: chimneys rising alongside temple columns, steam pipes running along classical friezes, factories built with the grandeur previously reserved for palaces and religious structures. The social structures would seem similarly paradoxical, still hierarchical in ways typical of ancient civilizations, with kings, priests, and aristocrats at the top, but now featuring recognizable middle classes of engineers, technicians, and industrial administrators. Slavery still exists but has evolved away from mass labor, now more efficiently performed by machines, toward domestic service and specialized work requiring human judgment. The intellectual climate would perhaps be most startling of all. Literacy rates of 30 to 40% in major urban centers. Technical education widely available through formal schools. Libraries containing not just religious texts and historical records but engineering manuals, scientific treatises, and technical journals. Public lectures where natural philosophers demonstrate mechanical principles and debate theories of matter, energy, and motion, and on the horizon loom developments that will accelerate this alternate world's technological evolution even further. Primitive calculating devices evolve toward true computational capabilities. Electrical experiments move from curiosities toward practical applications. Systematic astronomical observation and mathematical analysis lay the groundwork for a genuine scientific revolution occurring 2 millennia before our own. What becomes of this industrialized ancient world? Does it achieve a sustainable balance with its environment, or does ecological collapse eventually check its growth? Does its technological head start accelerate all subsequent human development, or does it eventually hit the same limits our industrial civilization encountered? Do its social structures evolve toward greater equality and democracy, or does technology merely reinforce existing hierarchies in new forms? These questions remain speculative, branching possibilities in an alternate timeline that diverged from our own when a single craftsman made a crucial observation and found himself in the right place, at the right time, with the right resources to transform that observation into a technological revolution. But they remind us that history's path is neither inevitable nor predetermined, that the world we inhabit represents just one of countless possibilities that might have emerged from the complex interplay of innovation, culture, and circumstance. Perhaps the most profound lesson of this counterfactual journey is not about technology itself, but about the societies that create and are created by it. The steam engine, iron production, and mechanical power were all theoretically possible in ancient Egypt. The raw materials, basic knowledge, and social organization necessary for their development existed. What was missing was not capability but context, the particular intersection of need, opportunity, and conceptual framework that would make such innovations seem not just possible but necessary. In our timeline, that intersection occurred in 18th century Britain, producing the Industrial Revolution that would transform our modern world. In our alternate history, it happened 3,000 years earlier along the banks of the Nile. The technological principles remained the same, what changed was the human context in which they emerged and were understood. And in that observation lies a powerful reminder about our own relationship with technology, that the machines, systems, and devices that shape our lives are never merely technical achievements but always expressions of human choices, values, and imagination. The steam-powered world of industrial Egypt never existed, but exploring its possibilities illuminates the complex relationship between technology and history that continues to shape our reality today.